Welcome, everyone. We are thrilled to have you with us today. Excelsior University Leadership, the Center for Social Justice, and the Race and Ethnicity Rope Team welcome you to Excelsior celebration of this year's Juneteenth. Happy Juneteenth, everyone. We have a very special guest with us today, Dr. Tim Wilson, a role model in higher education and the community, and a wonderful advocate and partner of our ongoing justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion work. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon, Tim. We really appreciate your presence, and we're honored to have you. Before we introduce you formally, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. David Scable, president of Excelsior University, who has kindly offered to say a few words about Juneteenth. David?
Thank you, Daniel, and hello, everybody. On June 19th, 1865, Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, to announce the emancipation of all enslaved people in the South, more than 2 years after President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. The momentous day known as Juneteenth marks the true end of slavery in the United States and is celebrated annually on June 19th. As we commemorate Juneteenth in 2024, we honor the resilience and determination of enslaved Africans and their descendants who fought for freedom and equality. We recognize the struggles of the past, the progress made, and the ongoing pursuit of racial justice and equity. Juneteenth is a celebration of African American culture, heritage, and contributions to American society. It is a day to reflect on the legacy of slavery, segregation, and systemic racism, and to recommit ourselves to build a more equitable and just society for all. According to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Juneteenth is a celebration of the human spirit and the power of freedom and equality. Let's come together on this Juneteenth 2024 to celebrate our shared humanity, our diversity, and our collective pursuit of a brighter future for all. Daniel, back to you.
Thank you, David. Before we pass the microphone to Tim, I want to thank a number of people and units that made today's event possible, starting with Linda, Maria, and Nyla from marketing, Erin, Jason, and Connor from communications, our president, David, Jill and Lori from the president's office, Kamel from HR, and Pam from the Center for Social Justice. Thank you so much for your amazing partnership and for your support. And now, I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Tim Wilson, who is the Dean of Student Affairs at the University of Washington Bothell. In his 30-plus years of higher education, Tim has held a variety of professional and graduate positions in residential life, multicultural affairs, student activities, and career services, including at Seattle University, where I had the privilege of learning from and working with him. I reminded him yesterday that when I joined Seattle University, he asked me the toughest question, which I still appreciate today. Tim earned a Bachelor of Science degree in marketing from San Diego State University, a Master of Education degree in higher education and student affairs from the University of Vermont, and a Doctor of Philosophy degree from the University of Missouri, Columbia. He has been married to his wife, Nicole, for 17 years, a wonderful person, and together they are raising their 14-year-old daughter, an amazing athlete, Chloe. In their spare time, they enjoy entertaining, cooking, and traveling. Tim, thank you for joining us today. We're honored, and the floor is yours.
Okay, there we go. Sorry, I had a little technical difficulty. That always happens right when you're supposed to speak. Daniel, thank you so much for the kind introduction. Again, my name is Tim Wilson. I use he, him, and his pronouns, and I'm coming to you from what is a foggy Northwest day here in Bothell, Washington. And I'm glad to be able to spend some time with you to talk a little bit about Juneteenth and my own reflections on it. And I'll get more into that in a little bit, but I do want to give you some context as to what I'm hoping that we can talk about today. Spend some time talking about who I am, how I come to my own understanding of Juneteenth. I'm going to talk a little bit about the historical context of Juneteenth. I don't want to assume that everybody understands what it is. So I want to give just a brief historical primer. I want to talk a little bit about an example of Wild Dreams, and I will be using my own parents as that example. And then I want to talk a little bit about what I've discovered about Excelsior and what I think your role can be in making dreams come true. We'll have a little time to discuss, and then we will conclude our day together. And in case you're wondering, this right here is the Juneteenth flag. There is a flag for it, and this is what it looks like. So who I am the youngest of three boys. I am originally from California. Did most of my growing up in the Monterey area, and then moved up to the Bay Area for my last 2 years of high school. As Daniel said, I'm a higher education professional, and it's hard for me to believe, but it's been 30 plus years since I started in this field. It goes really fast. I'm a husband and a father, and I'm a Black man living in America. And the picture you see of me, I think I was 2 or 3. I remember that tricycle. It was the greatest thing I ever had, and I miss it to this day. And those red overalls are kicking too. So what is Juneteenth? A really brief primer here. Within the context, the Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery on January 1, 1863. But enslaved people in the Confederacy did not receive word of the emancipation until 1865. And if you think about it, that kind of makes sense. People in the Confederate States were not willing to give up their cheap labor and their economic power. They weren't going to give that up simply because Abraham Lincoln said so. So Union troops, a couple years later, went down to Texas, to Galveston. They freed 250,000 enslaved individuals there and delivered news of their freedom. And that is why Juneteenth has always been big in Texas. It has always been a big, big event in Texas. And over time, news of what Juneteenth was, the celebration of Juneteenth eventually spread, but it has always been big in Texas. And it's often referred to as the second Independence Day. You've got July 4, but for a lot of folks who look like me, we count Juneteenth as the day that we were really kind of free-ish, as you see there. My source on this is the African American Museum in Washington, D.C. So why did Lincoln do this? What was the rationale for him? And there's a lot of rationales as to why, but here are 4 that are pretty significant. Number 1 is military strategy. Freeing enslaved individuals would weaken the Confederacy and rally the Union. And as I remember things, really the Confederacy could have won the Civil War after the first battle. They could have won that. Had Robert E. Lee just kept pursuing Union troops, he could have walked right into Washington, D.C. and taken over the whole thing. But for whatever reason, he didn't. Okay. Next thing is that there's pressure from abolitionists. They were wanting Lincoln to do something big to really disrupt and end slavery. And they thought that the proclamation would be a good thing to do. And they were really on this for Lincoln, really since the start of his administration. There was a Union victory. The Secretary of State wanted to wait until a Union military victory before issuing the proclamation so that the government could show the American people that it could be enforced. So Lincoln waited until after the Union won the Battle of Antietam in September 1862. Right. And then there's a moral conviction. And here's where things get a little gray. Lincoln abhorred slavery, and issuing the proclamation allowed him to align his values with his actions. But, and it's a big but here, just because Lincoln did not like slavery does not mean that he valued the humanity of Black people. Okay, there's a quote that I tried to find from my undergraduate days that basically said that Lincoln didn't believe that Africans had souls. He did not believe in their humanity. So really, the moral conviction is kind of murky for Lincoln, and it's important to remember that Lincoln's charge as president was to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, and the Confederate secession was against the Constitution. So bottom line, Lincoln was trying to win a war, and he thought that freeing the slaves or the enslaved people would allow him to do that more easily and more quickly. And I don't want anybody to ever lose sight of that this was a tactical move that had some moral adjacency to it, but it was not driven by a moral conviction. And here is a quote that supports my last point there. My interest is in uniting the nation. If I can do that by not freeing any slaves, I won't do it. If to do that I must free some and leave others, I'll do that. If to do that I must free all slaves, I will do that. But my interest is in uniting the nation. I just want to let that sit for a minute so that we have an understanding as to why the proclamation was issued, but to also human texture to this. We always, as human beings, have all sorts of reasons for why we do things. And Abraham Lincoln was no different. Okay. So a little bit more about me and mine and who I am. So I'm a son, I'm a sibling, like I said, I'm the youngest of three. I'm a husband and I'm a parent. And as you can see here, this picture was actually taken last week. This is my daughter, Chloe, she's 14. This is my wife, Nicole. I won't say how old she is. And this was taken in Eugene, Oregon at a track meet. As Daniel said, my daughter is a track fiend. She's a track athlete. We were at Nike Outdoor Nationals last week. And this was a picture right after she'd run a great 200-meter race. Okay. Also, I am the youngest of Jonathan and Minnie. This is Jonathan Minnie, and this is Jonathan and Minnie. These are my parents. They passed away last fall within 9 days of each other. My father passed away on October 23rd, and my mother passed away on the morning of November 1st. They had been together as a couple for 72 years, and they've been married for 68 of those. As you can see here, my dad was in the military and retired and went on to be a pastor. And I think after my dad passed away, my mom said, no more long deployments. You're not getting away from me that fast. And she passed away as well. And having said that, my father was from Texas, so he knew all about Juneteenth. And my mother was from Mississippi, so I am a grandson of the South. And I'm a son of the West. I spent most of all of my growing up in California. And as such, I'm a descendant of enslaved peoples. So when we talk about wild dreams, I can't imagine what they would say to me in terms of what I'm doing and what I've been able to achieve, much less what my parents were doing and what they were able to achieve. And I'm going to get into that in just a little bit. So like I said, my parents are children of the South. They grew up during the height of Jim Crow and the Great Depression. My grandfather on my dad's side was a sharecropper. And I remember my dad telling stories about how no matter how hard my grandfather worked the land, he always just seemed to come up just short of being able to turn a profit. My grandparents on my mom's side, so my grandmother on my mom's side, was a domestic. She would take in linens. She apparently was an incredible baker. In fact, she would bake wedding cakes for anybody in the neighborhood who was getting married. And my grandfather was a plumber, but he also worked in factories. So he spent a lot of time in Cleveland and Cincinnati and would send money back. So this theme of deployment, this theme of separation runs deep in my family. With my grandfather on my mom's side, it was going to work in a factory. For my parents, for my dad, it was being deployed around the world in the military. And really the dream for my dad was to be able to go to college. He did a semester at the University of Denver and couldn't afford it, so then he joined the military. And his plan was to do his 4 years, save up enough money, and then be able to go to college. Well, he did his 4 years, he saved money, and in those days, you didn't have direct deposit. Because they grew up during the Depression, there's a little bit of skittishness around banks. So my dad did what a lot of people did, and he sent his money back to a cousin, I believe in Texas. And when it was time for my dad to get out, he said, well, how's my money doing? And his cousin said, well, I spent it. So he had to start his dream all over again. He's like, I could be mad, and I was, but I had to go back and re-enlist. So he went back and re-enlisted and eventually retired from the military. He never intended to spend almost 30 years in the military. For my mom, this was really about to see the world more freely. I got her to open up about her growing up maybe 2-3 months before she passed away. And she told me that my grandfather was always very protective of her. She was the only girl out of 4 kids. So the boys could do whatever they wanted within reason in Jim Crow South. But he was far more protective of her. So she said, I didn't spend my first sleepover with anybody 12 or 13. And then it was across the street at my aunt's house, And whenever I would ask, well, can I go to a dance? Can I do this? Can I do that? The other? My grandfather would always say, well, a little girl's place is at home. So for her, I remember her telling me, she said, no, I always wanted to be a parent, and I was hoping to have a little girl. So then I could just let her go do everything. Now, she didn't have any girls, but she still did this thing of into my siblings and I being able to do everything within reason. So there's a lot of stuff that we got to do that they never could have dreamed of. And some of that was the way that she grew up. Now, our kids, or most of the girls, we have one non-binary nibbling, but our parents really sewed into them as well. So if they wanted to go travel with a school group, grandma and grandpa were writing a check to help them out because they wanted to sew into them because that was part of their dream. And in fact, my mom had a full ride scholarship to go to Tougaloo College. So my mom was from Mississippi, Tougaloo was in Alabama, but she said, I didn't want to be a school teacher. So she went to St. Philip's Nursing School in Richmond, Virginia, where she knew no one and wanted to start life there because, again, she wanted to see everything. Before that, she said she thought about being a missionary. And it was a big deal for her, and I never found out how she was able to get my grandfather to agree, but she went by herself to a convention in San Francisco by train to a missionaries conference, and then took a side trip down to Mexico. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with California geography, but from San Francisco down to Tijuana, where she went, on a good day, with the traffic not being very bad, you could probably make it in 10 hours. Back in the 1950s, it was probably a 14-hour bus ride. And she went down there by herself. So even though my mom had sort of this quiet demeanor, she had this adventurous spirit to where she wanted to see and do everything. And those were their dreams. Those were their dreams for themselves. Those were their dreams for us. And they had all these things in the way, but they kept finding ways to make it happen. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we move on. But that's sort of the context of my mom and dad. So why do you need to know this? It's because context is everything. It influences who we are, how we experience, see, and really name the world. And context also determines how wild a dream is. What I just described, for some folks listening today, that may not be a wild dream at all. But for 2 kids that were born in the Depression era South, being able to just even get out of the state was a huge deal. So this little kiddo right here, that's my daughter. She's had a passport since she was 3 months old. She's never known life without a passport. I didn't get my passport until I was in my mid-30s. This one right here, they live in London, not London, Ontario, London, England. They're a graphic designer. They've been out there for 4 or 5 years. This one lives in New York City. This one here lives in DC. These are things that seem just kind of like next steps for them, but I know my parents were like, wow, they are just really living life and we love it. And those are huge, wild dreams because we were all born in a different context than what my parents were. And as you can tell, these are my siblings. This is my brother Paul. It's my brother Stephen. This is his wife Donna. I don't know why Paul's wife Nola isn't in the picture. I think that's her hand right there. For whatever reason, she got cut out. Sorry, Nola. But I say that to say that the context really drives how wild the dream is, and I don't want us to lose sight of that. Let's talk a bit about wild dreams. What does it take to do? What does it take to make them come true? Well, in no particular order, you got to have a plan. A plan helps to guide effort, manage your energy and your expectations, but it's also subject to change. I remember working at the University of Missouri doing career development. And I remember talking to a colleague who was trying to make a decision as to whether to take one job or go and do something else completely wild. And I remember looking at her and saying, you know, it's easy for me to say, why don't you go do the completely wild thing? Because I'd hate for you to go through life and look in its rearview mirror and say, wow, I wish I'd gone left instead of right. And she actually did take my advice. She went left. She was like, oh man, that was the best advice I could have given. And I was like, I'm glad that worked out. But it's good to have a plan, but it's also good to be flexible. It takes sacrifice. Like I said, my grandparents worked as sharecroppers, domestics, factory workers. They suffered a lot of indignities based on race and gender, a lot of which we will never know because they've all passed on. I talked about my paternal grandfather being cheated out of a just wage as a sharecropper. I can guarantee you that my maternal grandfather was paid a lot less than his white co-workers for the same or more dangerous work in factories. They were separated from families for long periods of time in order to provide economically so that you could pursue those dreams. So a lot of dreams do require some sacrifice, but they also require vision. You've got to be able to see the future better than the reality. Okay. And that was especially true for my parents and grandparents. They had to be able to see beyond what Jim Crow was telling them that they could look at. You've got to be able to believe it even when you can't see it. You got to have a work ethic. Long and often extra hours have to be put in order to make dreams come true. And that adage, you have to be twice as good in order to get half as much, that was burned into my brain. For better or for worse, but it was burned into my brain. And for my parents and grandparents, they were working multiple jobs in order to make ends meet so they can make dreams come true. You got to have courage. More than once, my parents had to step out on their own in order to take next steps in life. Like I said, my mother went to nursing school in Virginia. My grandfather sent my dad and my uncle out of state when my uncle was maybe about 20 years old. My uncle was falsely accused of some improprieties with a young woman, and it became dangerous for them to be there. So my grandfather didn't hesitate and sent them both to Denver, where we had family. And that's where my father finished up his high school years. But there's got to be some courage there in order to do the things that you need to do. And speaking of courage and persistence, I'll tell you, my mother in nursing school, her clinicals were in a sanitarium. And that's when tuberculosis was rampant. And she contracted tuberculosis. So as she was recovering, and it took her a year to recover, she did all of her coursework from the hospital. She and my father had just started dating. So my father would hitchhike from his Army base to see her on the weekends and then hitchhike back. That's a lot of persistence. And she did finish her degree. The only job I ever knew her to have was being a nurse, but she was not going to quit on that degree. And it takes some persistence. Also having access and support go hand in hand. So when my father retired from the military, he went back to school, eventually went back to school. It was great that there was a local community college that he could go to, but it wouldn't have been able to do it and support all of us. My oldest brother was in college. My older brother was in high school, was at an all-boys high school, and I was at a local Catholic school. Pardon me. And had it not been for the GI Bill and some prudent investing and saving, none of us would have ever got through school. So being able to get into school is one thing, but having the resources available to be able to keep going with life was something else, and they have that. And then really meeting people where they are. And this is where I think you all at Excelsior are uniquely positioned to help students make their dreams come true. I get the sense that you're in position to help students identify and articulate what their strengths are, and then encourage them to lead with those strengths, to lean into them as they make their way through. And Tara Yoso talks about this when she describes cultural community wealth. There's 6 forms of community wealth that she identifies. There's the aspirational, there's the navigational, there's linguistic, there's just, I remember off the top of my head, but her whole thing is saying that often students of color are first generation students of color in college are often faulted for what they don't know, but we often forget that they know a lot and they've had to do a lot in order to get to that point, just being able to even walk in the doors of a college. So let's lean in, help them lean into what they already do really well and proceed from there. And I think you all are very uniquely positioned to help students do that. And in my research, I did a little digging and found your mission statement, to which I fully understand why Daniel is here with you, based on this mission statement, in that you're providing educational opportunities to adult learners with an emphasis on those who are historically underrepresented in higher education. That is amazing. That is really attractive. You meet students where they are, academically, geographically, understand that you're much more of an online access institution, that you offer quality and structure, and the assessment of the learning. And the assessment is so very, very important. Daniel notes that I am an assessment fiend. I love data, not just to collect data, but data helps us understand how we're doing, what we're doing, and how we can improve. So you all are in a great position to help students really achieve their dreams, and do more than they actually thought that they could do. And again, your mission, your access, you make dreams come true. You meet students where they are. So, you know, in terms of thinking about how you do it, what do you know about your students? Like if I asked you right now without looking at any data, what can you tell me about your students? What would you say? How do you know it? And do you know students well enough to help them? Meaning making. I'm also a fan of Paulo Freire and the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And while I know that's kind of a thick read, here's what I come away with from that particular text. Our job as educators is to help learners develop the vocabulary necessary for them to articulate and name the vocabulary so they can name their experiences. That's it. Whether those experiences and those truths are personal or professional, it's our job to help students develop that vocabulary so they can name their experience, and that's what makes them human. So how well do you help students make meaning of and incorporate their experiences into their learning? Are you doing this? And what does it look like when you do it well? Okay. I'm not asking these questions just to ask them. This is the part now where you get to help. So we're going to have some small group discussion. You're going to be sent to breakout rooms. Questions will be in the chat. We also have a Menti board. I know that sometimes people don't feel real comfortable maybe verbalizing. So if you want to type something into the Menti board, you can do that. That information will be available. We're going to give about 15 to 20 minutes for you to do that. And then we will come back and have some conversation about what came up and what we can do and how we can move forward. So I will turn things over now to folks to be put into breakout rooms, and I will see you soon. As you were talking, what came up? What did you talk about? And I'll also let you know that I worked at a Jesuit institution for 14 years, so silence don't scare me.
I love it.
They used to have silent retreats. So
I will chime in because in our breakout session, one of the things I did mention, and we had the pleasure of having Tim as a part of our group, I said we noticed that Excelsior has a huge military presence as part of their population base from a student aspect. And it's the fact that Excelsior is able to meet those military folks where they are to allow them to further their career, whether they want to stay in the military or get their degree so they can run off into the private sector. So I think that's one of the great partnerships that Excelsior has a leg up on other institutions of learning.
Tim, I gotta say, and I was mentioning this in the group where I was, I think that the question of context and experience and story has become such an important one. To start with, one of the arguments that I was making is that andragogically, and in terms of how do we help students learn, the more aligned or the more connected the learning is to their experience, the stronger the learning will be. So that's one. Two, unfortunately, higher education hasn't been designed for that, right? If I count the number of courses I've gone through that have asked me about my story, I can count them with the fingers of one hand, right? And that's a very small amount compared to the amount of courses I've gone through. But the other thing that comes to mind is the context does determine a lot in terms not only of where we come from and what things mean to us, how I like what you're saying, how wild dreams are, which is, by the way, is the theme of this year's Juneteenth. But also how important it is that in this moment, when things have become so polarized, when we as a society are struggling to open up to differences, right, that we don't understand, to perspectives that are very difficult for us to understand, is to go to the context, because the context is the one that explains the potential pain that's behind a way in which someone is acting or thinking, or how we are thinking, right? And that question alone, right, can open up a dialogue that otherwise would never be available. So I'm really appreciative of that, and I think it's one of the most important questions that we can be asking in our work with students and in our work with each other.
And I want to say, one, I appreciate what you said, but I also want to throw out the reality that context is hard. It's hard to sit patiently and listen to somebody else's truth, especially when I got my mind made up and I'm not listening to understand. I'm listening for a point and an opening to tell you how wrong you are. And especially in our own in our own societal context where everything is just so damn fast. So fast. I can pick up my phone, type in a question, and have an answer in seconds. I can put something in the microwave and I'm mad if it's not hot in 60 seconds, right? Context is difficult to do. It requires a different kind of patience and a different kind of pacing that we're not as good at now as we were when I was a little kid. And we probably weren't even good at it then. But we didn't have the internet. And we didn't have cell phones. I tell my daughter, I remember when cell phones were as big as your head. You had to literally carry it around in a bag. And she doesn't believe me. I'm like, oh, honey, let daddy Google it for you, right? That's there. But yeah, I don't want to, I don't want us to think that context just happens like that. It requires a different kind of discipline. I saw somebody's hand up and then they left.
That was me.
Okay.
My name is Dr. Ramona Gresham. I just wanted to caveat after what Daniel has said. To have that student experience, I think we got to fight for DIA. we got to keep DEA into the education system, because I know that there is legislation trying to remove DEA from the colleges. And if you remove that, you're removing that experience to get to know that student, to engage that student, to be involved with the student, to get to know the students. And I agree that once you build that rapport, you open up the minds of students to want to experience and go further in their education. You shut them down, you're going to shut down that student. So we have to continue to fight for diversity, equity, and inclusion in all levels of education. That's just all I have to say.
Thank you, and I couldn't agree more. Other things that came up in your discussion, or is there anything that you want to ask me? Here's what I'll ask you in my remarks. Did I get it right?
This is Dr. Johnson. I wanted to say, like I said, in our group, what I did was I was asked to teach science and math at a 6th grade Catholic school or whatever. And you know, when kids are kicked out of the public schools, they're sent to the private schools. So nobody didn't tell me that I was going to get stuck with kids that have been kicked out of the regular school. So the majority of them, which was 6 boys, there were no girls. The boys, they like to rap, they like to play the drums, they like to do things like that, anything to just make a bunch of noise. I said, okay, all right, we're going to learn science through a rap today. So the guys, the little boy, he wrote it out and we sung it and we got the message across that day. The one other little boy, he likes to play the drums. I said, okay, you're good. This is the beat. You're going to play it. And by the end of that 40 minutes, because you only got 40 minutes to teach a lesson and to get that point across, we got across. And what I did was come down to their level. Forget the fact that I have a PhD or whatever, but you have to come down to their level because you already have yours. Now you got to make sure they get theirs. So that's what I did.
That's wonderful. And you met them where they were.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You met them right where they were and adapted the lesson to what they were interested in. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Dr. Wilson, I have 2 comments on the mentee, but before that, I will say regarding your comments, I think storytelling is the greatest form of learning. So when you ask personally, I will say, yes, you got it right. I loved hearing the trajectory of your family and the wildest dreams, which again is this year's themes, their wildest dreams. And you know, and you're absolutely right about context. Our wildest, we can't even imagine what our children will be capable of, you know, in 20, 30 years. And that'll be a wild dream for them as well when we think back or when we look back from today. So I'll just go ahead and say the 2 comments. What do we know about our students and how do we know it? And do we know them well enough to help them? So 2 folks responded, or 2 groups, I should say. Some students open up and are more comfortable sharing with their advisors and instructors and feel a connection, which is important. And then another comment is know your students holistically, not just academically. Be relevant and transparent with your students to achieve this mindset. You have to be authentic because students have a 6th sense.
Yeah, they will absolutely snuff out the BS, right? If they don't sense you being genuine. Another thing that came up in our conversation was around the engagement that students need to put forth in their educational process. And part of what I do here at UW Bothell, I manage our care team. So and I routinely remind my staff and faculty colleagues, and I say, look, I can lay out all sorts of resources for students. I can reach out to them 3, 4 times. But if they want to talk, I can't make them. Mm-hmm. If they don't want to take the resources, I can't make them. You know, so I think, and we have to be careful with that mindset because that can be easy to say, well, if the student had just X, Y, Z. No, it's a little bit more than that. I might have to try some different methods to get through to a student. But it's important for me to ask myself, what is mine to carry? That's been a meditation that I've been on for myself for this entire year, and that I've talked to a couple staff members about is what is yours to carry? Yes, I know that staff member is annoying. Yes, I know that student really needs some help, but is that yours to carry? Is it all yours to carry? And I think as long as we're carrying what's ours and offering help to students when they need it and being genuine with that, more often than not, that student's going to take you up on it. Or it might take them a little while, but they'll come back. Just got to make sure that the front light's on so they can find their way in.
Tim,
Yes.
thank you so much for helping us explore and learn today. Unfortunately, I'm looking at the clock and we're out of time. So I want to respect people's scheduled time to join us. A word of encouragement. It is so important for us to open ourselves to the context of others, which might mean for us to step at least momentarily away from our context, right? And go through that courage that Tim was talking about, including our students, but including each other and including members of our community. That is the only way to begin to bridge the divide that we're experiencing. Even when we don't understand that other context or when that is really uncomfortable, it is so important to open up to it. And Tim, thank you for your wisdom, for sharing your leadership with us. It is really an honor to have you today. Thank you, everyone, for your time and for celebrating Juneteenth with us. Let's continue celebrating Juneteenth through tomorrow and throughout the year, right? Because it shouldn't be just a one-day celebration. Tim, any final word before we close?
Yes, just one final thing, and I can't believe I didn't put this in the slides and talk about it a little bit. It's that when someone tells you what their dream is, remember how scary it can be to share that. That is a real vulnerable point to say, I really think I want to do, or do you think I could do X? That person has probably been thinking about how they would verbalize that for a long, long time. And you might be the first person that they ever verbalize it to, or they've built up the courage again to verbalize it because somebody else laughed at them or said, you can't do that. So no matter how wild the dream is, receive that and acknowledge the courage that it takes and maybe answer the question with, well, what do you think it would take? And then go from there.
Well,
Thank
wonderful.
you, everyone. It's been a real treat to be here. I really appreciate it.